Good Sunday afternoon. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to today's tropical weather outlook for August 23rd, 2026. Today, we are going to talk about two disturbances in the Atlantic, which are now up to a moderate chance of development, one in the subtropics, and of course, the wave signal that we've been monitoring for some time now, and new name storms also appearing in the Pacific as well, as that basin just continues to get more and more active. So, definitely quite a bit on today's plate. Let's start off by taking a look at the National Hurricane Center Bulletin for the Atlantic as we do every single video. Again, this is where we always start, the originator of all of the information, the National Hurricane Center. And we have our three disturbances that the National Hurricane Center has been monitoring for the last few days. This one out here in the northeastern Atlantic, I mentioned a few days ago, might have had a shot at trying to become and transitioning into a subtropical system, but that's not going to happen anymore. But we do have a new Invest 95L. We're now up to 95 in the numbering system of invests in the Atlantic. It's kind of like a naming system, like how we have the A, B, C, Arthur, Bertha, Crystal Ball, but instead for invests we have numbers, and we're now up to 95. AL, I mean, it's officially AL, but we call it, as tracker enthusiasts, we call it 95L for Atlantic, and it is up to a 40% chance of development today. And this could still potentially become a spin up here in the subtropics, as we typically see with these El Nino years. We tend to get a lot of these quick spin up storms that kind of, come in a clutch and pad the number count of the season a little bit. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see that, and it is up to a moderate chance after all. So the National Hurricane Center clearly does think that the chance for it is there, and I'll also show you what the models show for this in just a little bit. But, of course, the main signal we are keeping an eye out on, and the signal that I think is probably the most curious of the bunch as to whether or not it will develop, is the eastern MDR signal that we have here. Nice, long cone of shaded potential for development stretching all the way from the eastern Atlantic to the western Atlantic here, and you can kind of use that as a little bit of a hint of the main point that I'm going to be trying to drive home about with this potential wave here today. And this is up to a 50% chance as well. So both disturbances here right now in the Atlantic, aside for this, northeastern Atlantic disturbance, putting that aside, we do have two disturbances right now in the Atlantic today, which are increasing in their potential for development. Things are definitely getting interesting for sure. And in the Eastern Pacific, they are definitely continuing to get interesting. It's just a named storm, tropical machine out there right now. Two named storms already in the Central Pacific, Lala and Moke. And obviously both of these storms had and or will bring impacts here to Hawaii. Although Moke won't bring direct impacts, it's mainly going to be the rainfall, as we've been talking about for the last 2 days. But again, do not get caught off guard by that. But we also have more here developing in the Eastern Pacific. Tropical storm Iselle, 45 miles per hour right now, and this formed today. But this is going to be a tropical storm and probably just stay out to sea here. In fact, let's actually take a look at the cone right now. Well, it is actually going to become a hurricane potentially, and maybe move on off to the west-northwest here, but it's going to stay away from Mexico and more than likely stay out to sea. So won't have to worry about Iselle too much, besides that. But then we do have two other areas here that are also on the list of potentially watch for development, and we already have one that is at a 70% chance right now, and yet another one which I think appeared today. So the Eastern Pacific here just continuing to produce storm after storm after storm, very likely, and that will continue over the next few weeks. And of course, we will take a look at what the models show today for the Pacific later on. Starting off with the current conditions right now, though, in the Atlantic with, the satellite shot, as we always do. Not much happening across the basin right now, although there are definitely a few areas here in which you could see bubbling convection is occurring. Obviously, the first area here with 95L, and let's actually zoom in on it right now. You can definitely see that there is quite a bit of convection bubbling with 95L today. Not necessarily a defined circulation just yet, but, it does have the look of a system here in the Atlantic that you would look at and say, maybe this one could be a quick spin up and something that could come out of the blue, as we sometimes get in the Atlantic here. So we will be watching this very closely, and very likely, if this does develop, this will be moving on off to the north. So probably will stay away from Bermuda, so that's good news. But if we do get some development, maybe it could be something potentially for Atlantic Canada to watch here. Although either way, anything that does develop will probably not be very consequential in intensity, but very likely could maybe see another quick name here to add onto the list of storms in the Atlantic. But again, the main area we are watching here is in the MDR, which has continuously, for the most part this season, been very, very quiet, as expected, thanks to El Nino and all of the dry air from the Saharan air layer and all of the general mid-level subsidence we've seen because of the unfavorable background state of the El Nino. That's kept a lid, it's kept a cap on things here, tropical development wise in the deep tropics. And of course, we also have the shear as well, especially as you get towards the Caribbean, which is, keeping things very hard shut completely. But again, as we get further and further and closer towards the end of the month, these tropical waves just can still continue to move off the coast of Africa, and they are getting stronger and stronger. And eventually one of them is going to develop. And you can see, let's now zoom over to Eastern Africa. There's definitely a wave here that is moving off the coast of Africa right now that is quite aggressive. And this is the wave that the models are picking up on over the next week here to potentially try to develop in the MDR. Will it do it? Are the models just faking out once again? Because we've seen that happen before this month, because again, conditions out there in the Atlantic are just not very favorable. And still want to show you here, taking a look at the Saharan air layer right now, it's still very prevalent, especially here in the Eastern Atlantic. And I will say that it's slightly dissipated a little bit, especially compared to earlier in the month. And again, that just naturally happens with climatology. The Saharan air layer generally lifts to the north and becomes much less dense over the MDR. So climatology is definitely helping, in that aspect a little bit, but just the general thermodynamics out here in the Eastern Atlantic are just still not very primed for development. Again, you can think that all due to El Nino. So will this wave actually develop, or will the models once again just be crying wolf and be picking up on a fake signal that just does not end up really doing much, as we saw earlier in the month with Invest 92L and 94L. So with that being said, let's see what the models show today, starting off with the 12Z GFS. And before I do focus on the wave here in the Eastern Atlantic, I do want to focus your attention on the Northwestern Atlantic with 95L. And you can see here, look at that, in the next 24 to 36 hours, there's definitely a small circulation or, surface low-level center that develops here. It's definitely very small, and if you're, not a very enthusiastic or very, I don't want to say autistic, but like someone who really pays attention closely to the tropics, you would probably brush this, small little low pressure off here. But that definitely tells me that maybe the GFS is indeed hinting at a weak tropical cyclone spinning up here from 95L, and it does happen within the next day or so. So we'll see whether or not that does actually come to fruition. And then this does move on off to the north and northeast very quickly, and probably will impact Atlantic Canada. Although, again, not as a very strong storm and very formidable whatsoever. So it's probably going to be gusty winds in the very least. But hey, that does highlight 95L there. And again, maybe we could get a quick spin up storm out of that. But then you can see here as we get further into next week, we have our wave in the Eastern Atlantic. And the models have been consistent and persistent in showing a signal here for probably the last week now, as always is the case, and probably even longer. And especially the GFS right now, very aggressive with showing something developing here. Probably makes it a hurricane almost immediately, within probably the next few days. Definitely by the end of next week we get it. And, from that, it ends up moving northward. and then curving out to sea here and not really being much of a threat to anybody. But the thing is, as we all know with the GFS, more than likely this model is overdoing it. I mean, the GFS, we all know the GFS has a convective bias in terms of overdoing intensity and, grabbing onto a vorticity area too aggressively and just running with it. And that's very, very clearly the case, especially with, this wave here, especially when you look at what all the other models show. Let's go to the European, for example, and see what it does here over the next few days. You can clearly tell that it does have a tropical wave that moves off the coast of Africa, and it definitely does try to develop the wave here, but nowhere near as aggressively as the GFS does. And let's just compare here the European. I mean, to be fair, it is a different run of the European. We're still on the 6Z while the GFS is on the 12Z, although I'm not really sure if the runs are going to make too much of a difference right now. But still, compare the European to the GFS, and the difference is just, it's jarring. It's night and day. The European is showing a wave that is barely developing, probably doesn't even develop in the MDR, and I say specifically in the MDR, and remember that because, our next topic in a moment related to this, you'll want to keep that in mind. But you could definitely see that the GFS is overdoing it, and maybe it's not, you never know, but just knowing the biases of these models, the European here, not really developing this much while the GFS is, and even though the GFS shows it, let's see how the environmental conditions are moisture-wise, and you could see, there's a lot of dry air here, especially in the eastern Atlantic. Probably still lots of Saharan air, and you can even see that on the GFS. It kind of gets wrapped up into this low pressure here, but, because of the mechanics of the model, it still just wants to make this, still wants to make this aggressive and a strong storm. So, kind of cannot really count on the GFS here in doing much, especially when, looking at the Euro, they definitely show whatever wave here trying to get going, struggling. And even taking a look at some of the other models as well, like the European AI model, and especially the AI models, and this is kind of transitioning into the next part here, they really don't show this, doing much as well, the Euro AI, and even the AI GFS. So the AI GFS does a little bit more, but the main thing is not as strong as the GFS, and obviously probably the biggest factor, again, is just because there's still lots of dry air and the environment out there is not very favorable. But I mean, there's still a signal here on most of the models appearing. So I guess we will still have to watch and see, and actually see if development does occur in the end. And taking a look at the ensembles too, the European ensembles today, I mean, there is a decent signal here. Looks like most of the ensembles still try to show development occurring in the MDR, although, most of the ensembles here do remain weak. And then same thing with the AI models too. But then here's an interesting part. Notice how most of the ensembles here stay weak, but then a lot of them really start to flourish as this system gets west. And I've said before, just because something doesn't develop here in the MDR and particularly take off immediately doesn't mean that it won't develop and try to blossom further west. And we've seen that happen many times before, but especially in a year like this year, where the deep tropics are very much being plagued by unfavorable conditions because of the overall atmospheric pattern that we are in. But the subtropics, on the other hand, are definitely not as unfavorable, and especially if we are having these, storms that are trying to spin up here. So we will see. This is a very interesting scenario that I see here on the models showing up. And it is the peak of hurricane season after all, so you can't count anything out. So we'll be watching this wave. That is my point. We will be watching and seeing whether or not it is real. And the models, again, just still have an overall signal of something coming together. But this is another point again to the GFS probably overdoing things. Andy Hazelton mentioning what's interesting is the AI GFS is much more muted on development, like other models, showing a weaker system limping towards the Lesser Antilles. This is a clue that the bias in the MDR genesis is probably not an initialization issue, but more related to the model physics, and he is responding that to a tweet he also made saying, find someone who believes in you the way the GFS believes in MDR waves becoming hurricanes. So again, that just kind of adds on to the point that the GFS is probably the most aggressive model out of the bunch right now. So I wouldn't really pay attention to it. But, again, the most of the models here showing something weak throughout the MDR, but then still trying to blossom here in the Western Atlantic. And the Western Atlantic is probably the more favorable area in the tropics right now if something does try to get going. And, taking a look at the sea surface temperature anomalies across the Atlantic right now, I mean, most of the Atlantic is warm, including the Eastern Atlantic. Sea surface temperatures are quite a bit above normal, and, this has really been something that has come up and really appeared over just the last few weeks. And maybe we'll see if this still kind of has an effect on the peak of the season by the time we get to next month. But especially focusing on the Western Atlantic and in the subtropics, where conditions are definitely more favorable than the deep tropics right now. It is very warm. Sea surface temperature anomalies are boiling right now, so it's just a matter of does a wave, even if it doesn't develop, if it survives and is able to persist through unfavorable conditions here, can it get into the Western Atlantic and eventually try to blossom? So we will be watching this signal very closely over the next few weeks. And I mean, even with the uncertainty that we have in the models right now, and just the questions that a lot of people have, and rightfully so, because we've seen these signals like we are having right now. With the signal we have right now, we saw this a few weeks ago, and the models were really aggressive on it, except for the AI models, which really don't show much here. And I also showed you here with the AI GFS and especially the AI European, not aggressive whatsoever and really showing much development occurring. In fact, I mean, they still show some development, but the problem is it stays very weak. And then eventually down the line, it crashes into the Caribbean. And obviously there's the shear wall that we have in the Caribbean thanks to El Nino, and of course land interaction as well. So we don't see much come out of the AI models versus the GFS, which is very aggressive. But there's all kinds of signals, we have the regular GFS on the other hand, which is very aggressive. Either way, there's a lot of uncertainty, but given the general nature of what I think is happening and coming together here in the MDR over the upcoming week, do not count anything out. And again, even if something doesn't develop here in the MDR, maybe it could develop further west and thrive, especially because of how warm sea surface temperatures are there. The story and the picture is probably not completely over just yet, and maybe if something potentially more substantial is coming, things might just still be only getting started. So we will be watching the Atlantic tropics here very closely. And naturally, as again, we are heading closer to the peak of the hurricane season. We are practically in it right now. It started on August 20th, and we are just 3 days in. And of course, the actual peak day of the hurricane season is September 10th. So we definitely still have quite a bit to go. And again, things are still definitely more than likely getting started. So we will be keeping an eye out on things here very closely. Before I end off, let's take a look at what's happening here in the Pacific right now, as it's still very active out there and only continuing to get more active. And this is, again, just the stark difference in just how favorable the atmosphere in general is between the Atlantic and the Pacific. So much convective activity happening across the Pacific right now, and that just tells you we are seeing much more favorability with rising air in the atmosphere. And again, that's all thanks to the El Nino that we have out there. And of course, from the fact that we have a lot of convective activity, we have a lot more opportunities and seedlings, which are leading to tropical development. And that's what we have here in the Pacific right now. Obviously, you could see this area here that I'm highlighting. That's Tropical Storm Iselle today, which formed today. And obviously, we also have 91E, which is off to the southwest, and definitely more areas here bubbling to the east and west of it, and probably, again, going to see more development over the coming week, weeks actually, not just the next week, but probably the next, week beyond that, and probably the week beyond that, probably all the way till the end of the hurricane season here. The GFS, we have the GFS up now, but the Pacific is going to be just pumping out storm after storm after storm, and I'm going to show you the GFS to prove that and prove as to why I think that'll be the case here. Starting off right now, obviously, we have Iselle here currently. That will more than likely intensify and again probably become a hurricane. And we do have Invest 91E as well, which is to the southwest, but that seems to be, it seems to get dragged into the circulation of Iselle and doesn't really do much. Maybe we have something else, though, that tries to develop far to the southwest of it. And then the monsoon here, the ITCZ here in the Pacific, really starts to get active. Looks like it kind of breaks down a little bit. And then from that, probably by the end of the week, we have maybe another 2 or even 3 more named storms in the Pacific. Probably going to get at least 1 or 2 more strong storms out of that. And then just, going well out into the future. And the model kind of doesn't load properly beyond that, although to be fair, the model is probably not done fully loading yet, but you could see what I mean. Storm after storm after storm. There's one. Another one probably pops up and, very long range becomes yet another strong storm. And, maybe if the model goes out beyond 384 hours here, this area here probably becomes yet another storm. And also notice too that, the more time we get further out, the more these storms do seem to get closer and closer to Mexico. And there's not necessarily any threat brewing to Mexico just yet, but that is a pattern that I think we're going to have to watch as we get later in the season. More of these storms are probably going to be developing closer to Mexico, and the general pattern of more troughiness, which develops over the west coast of the U.S. eventually, probably as we get into the late season. And I do think this will happen. It is my personal prediction. We probably will get at least 1 storm late in the season, which will probably recurve back into Mexico and more than likely be a substantial impact. And it's not looking like we're going to have anything like that just yet, but as the Pacific season here continues to progress, that is probably going to happen at some point. And of course, when that happens, we will be keeping an eye out and covering it very closely. So, lots to watch here in the tropics over the next few weeks. And again, as I always say every single video, I hope all of you continue to stay tuned. But that's going to do it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed what you saw today. If you did, I would really appreciate, as I always say every video, like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. And make sure to turn on notifications so you can get these tropical updates, which we are doing on a daily basis, the moment I upload them down to the second. And even when I do live streams as well, the moment I go live, you get the notification right to your phone as well, or whatever device you're on when it happens. So you'll definitely want to do that. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe. Peace, love, and kindness to all of you out there. Make sure to enjoy the rest of your weekend and enjoy the week ahead. And I'll be back with more tomorrow.